This evening, the government voted against the various amendments, the 7 amendments which had been added to the Rwanda bill by the Lords. The bill will therefore return to the Lords tomorrow, where it's expected that Labour and crossbench peers will try and reinstate 3 or 4 of those amendments. And Stephen Kinnock, the Labour MP, said that the government was flogging a dead horse over this policy more than 2 years after it was first introduced by Priti Patel and then championed by Suella Braverman with such vigour. You may recall that she chose to pick a fight not only with all migrants, but also with migrants specifically from Albania and from Pakistan, and refused absolutely to apologize for the vicious language that she employed about people from Albania. And there were marches on the streets, and the Albanian Prime Minister, Edi Rama, spoke out and asked for an apology, which never came. The Crown Prince of Albania, Prince Leka, also spoke about her extraordinary xenophobic language, and again there was no apology. And Rishi Sunak seems to have abandoned the idea of turning up to a party to celebrate Eid in his own 10 Downing Street, in his own headquarters, because he would rather be in the House of Commons voting for this miserable and pathetic law, which encapsulates an ideology which can go nowhere, because this law will be overturned by a Labour Party when it comes into power. This is, at the very most, even if it gets through, this will represent a Pyrrhic victory. And the irony in that is that King Pyrrhus, who was king of Epirus, was king of an area of land which is now identified as modern Albania. The historical and geographic irony of that, I think, cannot fail but to impress. And 2 years of flogging a dead horse and of indulging in parliamentary ping-pong, which can go on and on. And I think it's highly unlikely that the Lords are going to relent. This was not in the election manifesto. It's not covered by the Parliament Act. And so, one amendment after another was rejected by the Commons by a relatively small majority, 70, rejecting Amendment 7B, the same number rejecting Amendment 6B, and slightly less rejecting Amendment 1B. And it's Sir William Cash said that the House of Lords needs to calm down a bit over the Rwanda bill, but the House of Lords is there to correct, to oversee, and to revise with a thoughtful, measured approach the over-enthusiasm of the House of Commons. Jeremy Corbyn was heard this evening. He stood up and he said, if we pass this legislation into law, many others will follow. There are many people all over Europe, particularly in the Council of Europe, that have expressed grave concern about this piece of legislation, which is, in effect, outsourcing our international obligations under all aspects of humanitarian law. If we pass this legislation into law, many others will follow, and Europe will be turning its back on refugee problems it has often helped to create. He is absolutely and 100% right. The wise, the prudent, and the And the way to demonstrate our leadership in this issue would be to call an international conference and redefine once and for all the terms under which we accept and recognize refugees as migrants. The problem is not the European Court of Human Rights. The problem is not Europe. The problem is not the Channel or the Mediterranean. The problem is the 1951 Refugee Convention, which seems to be no longer fit for purpose. If that is the case, we should give a lead and call to have that revised. And there's no better way that Rishi Sunak could establish an international legacy than by calling such a conference. Even now, in the fading days of his premiership, he could do a little good and call such a meeting. Even a meeting that was only going to encompass the active members of modern Europe would be enough to set a mark in the sand. But this unilateral approach is nonsensical, and it simply sends a message out that international law can be defied with impunity. And that is not the right message that we should be sending at a time when there is so much international confusion and so much international bellicosity. We should not be joining that language of defiance. We should be helping to restructure our society. Part of that restructuring, I believe, should be to establish a consular presence across North Africa, in Turkey, in Albania, in the north of France, so that we can catch and process and help those people who would otherwise be lured by smugglers and traffickers into crossing these dangerous strips of water. If we led the way with that, other European countries would follow suit, and the smugglers and the traffickers would be out on a limb with no further employment. The people who turn to smugglers and traffickers are not aware that they are turning to smugglers and traffickers. They are turning to the only people with information. It's only in our rather abstract Western world that we think there's a big difference between the people in control, the authority figures, and the smugglers and the traffickers. In most countries, it's very difficult to tell the difference between one and the other. These are people with information. And somebody who is desperate will turn to somebody with information, whether they demand money from them or not. Anyway, most politicians in these countries from which people are fleeing are corrupt enough to demand money for that information anyway. So this absurdity that people like Suella Braverman, in her convenience and in her safety in Britain, the absurdity that these people say there is a difference between a smuggler, a trafficker, and the rule of law. These people are living in cloud cuckoo land. There is no difference. Indeed, the smuggler and the trafficker is probably significantly more benign than the local policeman, who has probably just tortured the individual in question, who feels they want to escape. Who do they escape to? If we have no consular presence in these countries, if we don't have help on hand, who do they turn to? They turn to the people who are offering that help. And then we punish them again. They're stripped of all their money. And then we punish them a second time by threatening to send them to Rwanda. And we think that is, in Rishi Sunak's words, a deterrent. And then because Rishi Sunak is so bound up, enslaved to the tyranny of sloganizing, he then goes on to repeat not only stopping the small boats, a phrase which he's picked up from his Australian advisors, but also jumping the queue. We'll stop people jumping the queue. There is no queue because Suella Braverman's two laws about nationality and about illegal migration have effectively stopped almost all safe and legal routes to the UK from other countries. So nobody's jumping any queues by coming here by small boats. It's the only way to come here, as indeed Suella Braverman admitted on the 22nd of November 2022 to Tim Lawton, a man who's clearly had enough and is not standing at the next general election.